Welcome, 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 and thank you so much for making it out in this awful weather. I'd like to thank Jonathan Ball and the fabulous team there for hosting this with us this evening. They are David's distributors in South Africa, and of course for bringing David Baddiel our way. I'd especially like to thank them for agreeing, and this was at the very last moment, to a special launch price for David's memoir, My Family, for just tonight. This book is a gem of a read, and I'd really like as many of you as possible to take it home tonight. It's also World Book Day, so it's a very good reason to support the industry. So tonight we're going to be selling My Family at 450 Rand, which is 10% off the sale price of 500 Rand. Thank you, Jonathan Ball. I'm going to be totally honest here, and I feel that I can be, because David Baddiel, as he explains right at the start of his memoir, has what he calls an on-the-spectrum need to tell the truth. So I totally relate to this. So I think he'll totally understand when I confess that I really did not feel like reading My Family. I'm not Jewish, I'm not English, I don't live in England, and all of that stuff. But since the moment I picked the book up, I've been laughing out loud, I've been sharing it with my family, and I basically just want to get back to it all the time because it really makes me laugh. It's refreshingly honest, it's interesting, and it's just hilarious all the time. So congratulations, David, and welcome to Love Books. It's just so lovely to have you here tonight. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about him. He's an author, a comedian, a screenwriter, and a television presenter. He's written 4 novels and 2 non-fiction books for adults, including the best-selling Jews Don't Count. And we're going to be talking, Matthew's going to be talking about all of these tonight. Jews Don't Count was the Sunday Times Politics and Current Affairs Book of the Year in 2021. He's also very well known as the author of 10 children's books that have together sold over 2 million copies. And I think we've been stocking these for at least 10 plus years. Chatting to David tonight is the inimitable Matthew Krouse, who I feel needs no introduction, especially for those who jawed in Joburg in the 1980s and the 1990s. He's a writer, he's an artist, and among many other very interesting things, he was arts editor at the Mail and Guardian from 1998 to 2014. He continues to write and work in the visual arts. Matthew, welcome, and it's lovely to have you here, and thank you. Over to you.
Hello. Hello, David.
Hello, Matthew.
Last 2 times I tried to RSVP over here, I couldn't get in, so I decided I would do it another way. I get paid to sit in the front. So David Baddiel, thank you for being with us. Tonight, of course, is Erev Yom HaShoah, so that's a very sort of like somber note on which to begin. I think that we have to acknowledge that because David's book has this background, kind of this context at the base of it that is his family history, which involves the Holocaust, escape, and making a new life in the UK, and in a way becoming a family that is kind of the every family. I know that the Guardian said, my family is less about how mums and dads fuck you up, as how they are weird and complicated and hilarious, and how you can miss them once they are dead, even though in life they could be massive pains in the ass. In giving us the full, unvarnished picture, Baddiel has done his parents proud. So, question, of course, is have you done your parents proud? Would they be okay with this difficult subject matter? And you can tell us what that is, and of course, how your mother, for example, came from where she came, and how she landed up where she landed up.
Okay, before I do that,
yes.
Thank you very much for coming out. I only flew from London this morning, overnight, so I may not be able to answer any questions at all. And I should tell you something that you may not know about coming to South Africa from the UK at the moment, which is everyone says don't fucking go. Everyone says you'll get mugged, you'll get killed or whatever, but I came anyway, so I'm really glad that you turned up. And I tell you what actually happened. This is amazing, which was I was on the taxi to Heathrow, which feels like 5 minutes ago, but it was just like on my way. Taxi to Heathrow Airport, and the guy driving said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "South Africa." And he went, "Oh God, oh blimey!" And he was Somalian, so that worried me a bit. And then he said, check out the government guidelines for the British government guidelines. The British government guidelines, I wouldn't advise anyone to read them because they basically say don't go. And then, because I've been to quite a lot of dangerous places, it said something which I've never seen before, which is that it says in Cape Town, if you're going from the airport, don't go down this road, don't go down that road, don't go there. What are you doing going there? It's the most specific don't go there stuff I've ever read in my life. And I'm going to Cape Town in 2 days. So nothing stops me, is what I'm saying, basically. So anyway, thank you very much. Shall I answer the question now? I just wanted to get all that off my chest.
Yeah.
So what happened, I did a stand-up show about my family in the West End in London, just after my mum died. And the reason I did that show, the kind of like emotional impulse, as I talk about in the book, was that at her funeral, which was in 2015, all these people were coming up to me that mainly I didn't know and were saying, your mother was wonderful. She was such a wonderful woman. She was so wonderful. And the thing that bound all these people together was that they didn't really know her. And what I realised, I had this kind of epiphany, which is that if all we can say about the dead after they've gone is that they were wonderful, we may as well say nothing. It felt to me like a second, deeper, more profound erasure at some level than death itself. And what I realised, particularly with my mother, was that the way that someone like that should be memorialised, to live in the memory, which is the point, after all, of how we think about the dead, is you have to highlight not this kind of idealised version of her, but her complete craziness, her madness, her flaws, because the dead, despite what we might like to think, are not angels. And we do them a disservice by imagining them. So this book is absurdly honest about both my parents. And the key thing about my mum is that she had an affair, sort of, but in her 30s and 40s, although she would tell you it went on her whole life. She had an affair with a golfing memorabilia salesman, and overnight became obsessed with, of all things, golf memorabilia. Right? She wrote 5 books about golf memorabilia. Everything she wore was golf related. Everywhere you looked, suddenly there's a golf statue. There's a sort of, statue of Lee Trevino or something. And no one, basically the way that families normalize things, this just happened without anyone really drawing attention to the fact that there was a man called David White who had a business called Golfiana that my mum just basically, she was shagging him, but also copying everything about his life. Like the way that my mum expressed to David White that she was in love with him was to set up a rival golfing memorabilia business. It's true, also called Golfiana, right? I was going to read for a bit, but shall we?
Yeah, do it, yeah. That's
okay,
good.
But just before I do that, I just wanted to read my mum wrote these 5 books about golf. They're called things like Golf, the Golden Years and stuff like that. And she always put a little poem at the start of them, and I just want to read one of those poems to you now. It's an epigraph to Golf, the Golden Years. What makes the sun shine all the year? What makes all cloudlets disappear? What binds in friendships strong, sincere? It's golf. Now, be honest, who knew that was the answer? But my mum, she became totally obsessed with golf, and she was very, very keen, in a way, that people should know about this, because she was very proud at some level of her affair. She felt it made her sophisticated, and I think she was proud of it for another reason, and this relates to your question, and I'm just going to read this bit, which perhaps makes this clear. I'm going to have to, because I'm old, I think that's possibly topical for some of you, that I'm going to have to wear these glasses. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to read this bit, which relates to, I used to do a show on British TV called Baddiel and Skinner Unplanned, where me and another comedian called Frank Skinner just talked about anything that came up. And my mum was in the audience once. Basically, when my mum, we used to bring people up on Baddiel and Skinner Unplanned, anyone out of the audience, to write things on the board that we had there so that we wouldn't repeat ourselves from week to week. When my mum turned up with my dad in the audience, I could feel her straining at the bit, desperate to come up and be this person who we called the secretary. And I put this to Frank, and Frank, who knew my mother well, was not keen, right? And what happened was Frank Skinner, I don't know if you know him at all, he's a famous British comedian, he said to me, look, you've put me in a terrible position now, because either I'll disappoint your mum, a lovely old lady, or the show will be shit. And my mum in the audience shouts, it always is. So you might have a sense of her from that. With all this in mind, it's worth going back to that episode of Baddiel and Skinner Unplanned featuring my mother. At one point in the episode, she feels the need to say, Sarah, pointing at me, I am related to that gentleman. He's my middle son. He also has an older brother and a younger brother. Her declaration of equal parental rights for all three sons gets a sympathetic sound of approval from the audience, which leads on to this dialogue. This is from me. I say, why did that get an R from various female members of the audience? Because my mum has had sex with my dad 3 times. That gets an R, which gets a laugh. The camera cuts to my dad laughing. Then my mum says, are you quite sure they're all from your father? Are you quite sure they're all from your father? This elicits a very big response from the audience. Laughter, applause, but also shock. It cuts back to my father. He is still smiling, but less so. I say, hang on a sec, mother. That's not a comeback to me. That's calling yourself a slag. I regret saying this now. It gets a big laugh, but I regret saying it now. But my mother betters me anyway with what she says back. Sarah, no, it's not. It's suggesting I had a good life. It's suggesting I had a good life. The idea that one of her children may not in fact be her husband's progeny is an indication, as far as she is concerned, that her life was lived to the full. This, I think, is one of the most revealing things, and it's a high bar. She was a woman of almost constant self-revelation, my mother ever said. It's at once deeply solipsistic, almost callous, given that my dad is in the audience. But on the other hand, it inspires in me now, as much does as I get older, and think about my flawed, damaged parents, a reflex jolt of sympathy. Not least because it makes me realise I have picked up a key thing from my mother, which is a very acute lack of shame. I don't really have the gene for shame, and with it, the corresponding one for judgment, particularly not for judgment about how people live their erotic lives within the obvious consensual parameters. Although there was one person here who wasn't consenting, which was my dad. So it's complicated. It shows that in her own way, my mum was a child of the 60s, a woman of the sexual revolution, except without much revolution, just mainly the sex. Sex was how she proved she was modern. And something else, and this finally answers your question. As we know from another appearance of hers when I was on TV, Who Do You Think You Are? You know, I don't know if you've got that lineage program. My mother was always chasing a phantom lost glamour. Her family in Germany had been rich. They had servants. My cousin Michael tells me they had a fucking Rubens. If she'd stayed in a Nazi-free Germany, she would probably have led a very glamorous life. She would have had a big society wedding and married a prince, not necessarily a royal one, but an elegant, high-class man of standing. She'd have lived somewhere grand on the Baltic Sea, surrounded by Rubens and amber. She may, of course, not have done any of that, but it was, I think, somewhere in the mix of her imagination, the Barbara von Cartland version of her life, in the parallel universe where Hitler never happened. But in the actual, more Nell Dunn version of her life, she didn't have access to anything equivalent. What she had was Dollis Hill, that's where we lived in London, 3 children and a husband uninterested in the emotional life. In that context, David White, her lover, with his smoothness, his pipe, his polo neck sweaters, and yes, his golf, with all his clubbable middle classness, it brought with it was the nearest thing she could get to that prince. Her affair made her feel not just that she was living a good life, but that she was living her good life. the one that had been stolen from her. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So then your dad, of course, is another completely different character. Your father landed up across the way from your mother in a market selling dinky cars, right? He was a collector. So both of your parents were collectors.
Yeah.
And then your father, a little later on, got dementia, and he got something called PICS. And I was telling you earlier on that my mother got dementia, and I looked after her for 2.5 years. And what happened was, the day that I admitted her to a great place, there was a woman there with PICS, and you'll tell us what that is. And I walked in and I introduced my mother and I said, everyone, here is my mom, and nobody took any notice of her. And there was a woman sitting over there, and she just looked up at me and she said to me, "You've been fucking the little boys with Dr. Fenster. You've been fucking the little boys with Dr. Fenster." And I looked and I realized, of course, Fenster is like a Yiddish name, basically. It could mean darkness or it could mean window. And from the months that followed, I was in a support group with her husband, who wept and wept and wept. And now you can tell us what PICS is.
Okay, so yes, so so the point about my dad is he got PICS disease, which is a frontal lobe dementia, and when he was about sort of 75, and I remember going to the geriatrician and the neurologist, and he said to me about PICS disease, he said the symptoms of PICS disease, you should know, include disinhibition, a tendency to obscenity, laziness, bad-temperedness. And I wanted to say, sorry, does he have a disease or have you just met him? Because my father was always exactly like that. Right, he was exactly like that. I remember once when we were young, having to leave an antique shop in Devon, in the West Country, in the UK, because my dad farted so badly they had to close the shop. Can I swear very badly?
Swear very bad.
Okay, the first time he met my wife, Morwenna, it was at my mum's 60th birthday party, and he opened the door and he went, "You couple of cunts are late." And this is supposed to be before he had the disinhibition, right? That's the problem with the whole notion of the disinhibition. At his funeral, and this wasn't really about him latterly, it was about my life with him when I was young, is that I said that my father was a man who liked football, food, and shouting, "Who the fucking hell is this now?" every time the phone rang, right? Just every single time. He was just constantly angry and annoyed and aggravated and very Welsh. He was extremely Welsh. One of the things about my dad being... It's an interesting thing is that some people don't understand how Jews had to migrate, had to flee to everywhere. Yeah. So some people can't quite process the idea of a Welsh Jew. Like my brother's very Anglican mother-in-law is always still saying to him, "Sorry, tell me again how your father was Welsh and Jewish." But what actually happened was, and a few people did this, is that basically my great-great-grandfather, because my mum was born in Nazi Germany. My mum was born in Königsberg in Nazi Germany. She only just got out with her with my grandparents, her parents, and ended up in Britain. And then my grandfather got interned. She had a terrible, terrible early childhood. And kind of the whole thing about my book is like intergenerational trauma that isn't necessarily tragic. It could be tragicomic. And that's how I feel she ended up, as I said, in this strange thing with the golfing memorabilia. With my dad, it's slightly different because my great-great-grandparents are from the Pale of Settlement from sort of Latvia and Lithuania. And in about 1890, my great-great-grandfather gets on a boat to New York. And he doesn't speak any English, and it stops at Swansea in Wales. He gets off, and 10 years later, he's got enough English to ask someone where the Statue of Liberty is, and, you know, it's too late, and that's why we're from Swansea, yeah? So my dad is really, really Welsh, really working class, and that's the way he coped with my mother's affair, which was unbelievably public. My mum would constantly tell anyone she could about her affair. She was so proud of it. He dealt with it just by tuning it out in a Welsh working class way. It was sort of unbelievable how it was sort of a frequency that he couldn't hear.
Okay, and so I see in one of your shows over there you did with with Skinner many years ago. He asks you, what kind of a Jew are you?
Does he?
Yes, he does. And you kind of get irritated with him. And you say, well, you know, you can't ask me that question. Yeah, you do. I watched it this afternoon. And so I want to ask you again. I mean, I know that...
You watched it this afternoon, but this is like 20 years ago for me.
Yeah, well, you know, it's there. Everything's on YouTube.
Okay.
I just want to tell you one anecdote. When we were growing up in Germiston, the rabbi told us this amazing story that if you take a Jewish child and you put the Jewish child in the bush, right, without any parents, without any guidance, without any knowledge of anything, you know, like a wild child, a feral child, that child will naturally grow up to speak Hebrew. Okay? So you must understand. That was us. And I believed that my entire childhood. And couldn't understand why, being on the East Rand, I was having such difficulty learning Hebrew when these fucking children who'd been abandoned were just learning it from, I don't know, the trees. So what kind of a Jew are you, actually?
Okay.
I mean, firstly, you're an atheist Jew. We know
Yes.
that.
Well, so I am an atheist Jew, and actually that's a very important part. I don't know how many of you have read Jews Don't Count, but thank you for the woo. I guess if I was to boil down the point about this book is it's about how in a time, it was written a few years ago and things have slightly shifted obviously, but it was written at a time when I'd started to notice that, you know, conversation about minorities and about inclusion and representation and offence and all that stuff was very live everywhere, especially online, but somehow completely missed out one particular type of minority, one particular type of representation, one particular type of discrimination, which was Jews. Jews were just not in that conversation, and therefore the book is called Jews Don't Count, because it's about how Jews for some reason don't count as a proper minority, and the people who are worried about minorities, progressives, why is that? What's their issue? And the book it sort of deals with that and explains why. It's to do with notions of power and all that, but there's one key moment which I think for some people was the thing that, like, the scales fell from their eyes, because a lot of people wrote to me about it when I talked about it on British TV once. It didn't occur to me as being a big thing, which was a lot of people think that racism against Jews isn't racism. They think it's religious intolerance. And so they can mark it down, because religious intolerance isn't as big a crime in our modern society as racism. But that's wrong, because I'm an atheist, and that would get me no free passes out of Auschwitz. None at all, right? And more importantly, my great-uncle Arno, who was completely an atheist, died in the Warsaw Ghetto. The Nazis didn't give a fuck about whether or not, you know, you kept kosher. And neither, by the way, the white supremacists chanting the Jews will not replace us in Charlottesville. They don't care about religion. They only care about, you know, basically whether you're born a Jew or not, which is what makes it racism. And actually there are, you know, Jews have a higher percentage of atheists in their community and still identify as Jews. I tell a story about this, which is a completely true story, which is that I am quite well known now in Britain as, like, been well known in Britain for ages, but since I've been talking about Jewishness, I get called by the Jewish community to do stuff, and my rabbi, not a man I know, because I'm an atheist, right? But my rabbi, my local rabbi where I live, calls me up. I don't know how he got my number, presumably because we secretly control the world. But you see, that's not true, you see. That's a joke based on a stereotype. But anyway, he calls me up and he says, will you be the Jew, the celebrity Jew who comes and lights the menorah outside our synagogue this year at Hanukkah? And I didn't really want to do that. It sounded quite naff to me, so I played what I thought was my trump card. I said, sorry, Rabbi, to tell you this, but I'm an atheist. He said, so am I. I thought, fucking hell. There's really more atheist Jews out there than I realised, right? But it's important, right? Because I think when people talk about what a Jew is, they connect to an idea, people who are not Jews, and maybe some Jews, but not that many, they connect to an idea of the religion. But I think most Jews, that isn't true. I think it's about culture, it's about tradition, it's about family, it's about comedy and food. But I'll tell you what it's primarily about, and a lot of people think, oh, we shouldn't say that, it's negative, but it's true. It's about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is probably the primary thing that makes me Jewish. How could it not? My whole family was murdered on my mother's side. My whole family was murdered, right? Apart from her and her parents. That's a huge family picture of them, of their family in the 20s. Dead, all of them. I don't know who most of them are. So how could it not? How can you, when people say, oh, you shouldn't be so negative in your idea, I'm not negative. I'm not negative in the same way that, if a black person is singing the blues, right, that comes out of oppression. It's still part of their identity. Similarly, if a Jew does comedy about the Holocaust or whatever, that is because that's a community who are dealing with the way that they've been persecuted. And I think, therefore, we should acknowledge it. It's part of the dance of being the minority that we are. So that's answers your question, I think.
In a way, I guess. I know it's a cultural thing, and of course we all feel it, and we're all sort of distantiated from a kind of origin story in a way. I mean, there are people who believe that the world was created over 7 days, 5,000 years ago. And I know that a friend of mine was sort of staying with his frum relatives in New York, and he woke up in kind of one night, and he walked to the dining room, and his frum sister-in-law was cutting pictures of dinosaurs out of school books and giving them to the children the next day because she didn't want this evolution story to be taught to her children. So, there's kind of different levels. I'm kind of interested in something about you, because I know from your story that you started out as a bit of a punk when you were a kid. You come from a kind of working class British background, or middle lower class British background. Of course, you've got this story, you're very Jewish, and then you did all these incredible comedy things. You filled up a stadium. Did you get rich that night?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm glad. I was very curious to know how much money you made there.
Right.
That's like,
it was
a Jackie Mason question,
Okay.
How much does he make here?
Right.
And then you kind of give it all over to Judaism.
No,
to
I don't.
Jewish.
No, that's not true.
Okay.
I don't. Actually, one of the things one of the things that's been happening is that, my publishers in Britain are very keen that I should write a follow-up. This book's been quite kind of successful, and they want me to write a follow-up, which I would call, I guess, Jews Still Don't Count. And I should, maybe, because the landscape has shifted and all that, but I am someone who hates repeating himself. I can't be doing with just saying the same things again. The coordinates that led to Jews not counting have just intensified over the last few years. So I don't know that I would have that much to say. There are a few things to say. One of my points in this book, which has definitely been complexified over the last couple of years, or certainly since October the 7th, one of my main points in this book is another way in which Jews don't count, is that they are imagined by progressives as all being entirely connected to what's happening in the Middle East, wherever they live. Wherever they live, essentially Jews are defined by and can be spoken to in terms of their relationship to Israel, Palestine. And my point is no. My point is that if progressives are to treat Jews as a proper minority, and indeed if we are to think of ourselves as a proper minority, we have to stop constantly accepting a definition of us as entirely umbilically connected to a country, for most of us, a long way away, because that doesn't happen to other minorities. There's a comedian, a British-Chinese comedian called Phil Wang. I'm very close to him. He's a very lovely guy. He interviewed me when my film of Jews Don't Count came. I did a documentary about it as well. And I would never have said to Phil Wang at any point in that conversation, or any point in my life, Phil, can you tell me what you think about the Chinese government and the way that they're treating the Uyghurs? I would never do that. That would be offensive. But I can promise you, every fucker will say to me, or any Jew, can I ask you what you think about what's happening in Israel, Palestine? Right? It just happened just now. It just happened now. I made a comment online. I'm not online or anything like I used to be, but I made a comment about the woke right. There's this thing called the woke right, this new phenomenon, and the woke right is basically just the Jew-hating right. That's all they really are. They use a fake idea of being concerned about other minorities to say that Jews are oppressing other minorities. It's just but immediately, as soon as I said that, I get hundreds of people saying, stuff about what about Palestine, even though I haven't said anything about Palestine, right? Because there's an assumption that connection is totally acceptable.
Okay, so I did watch also Hard Talk with Saka.
You?
Yeah,
Wow.
I did. Well, well, it was interesting because you were speaking about the social media, and maybe I think that it's kind of interesting and relevant to the discussion of why you stay there when you know it's such a shit place to be.
Well, I have moved away from it. So I was on Twitter when it was Twitter, and I used to get a lot of stuff, a lot of trolls and whatever. 2 reasons, or 3. Number 1, I was doing a show. So I did a show called Trolls Not the Dolls, which was entirely based on me treating trolls like hecklers, right? Because I thought as a comedian that I shouldn't not feed the trolls, that I should respond to them in a sort of, putting down hecklers' way. For example, I remember one person saying to me at one point that I was a stupid, privileged, he spelt it with an A, a stupid, privileged person who didn't understand the world. And I said, yes, I'm so privileged, I know how to spell it. And then someone else said, calling out spelling mistakes on Twitter is so 2015. And I said, yes, you spelt so wrong. Right? So basically I was using it to create a show. I was also using it, which most people like me do, to sell stuff, tickets and books and whatever. It's a good place to sell things. I'm not on it anything like as much as I used to be, mainly because I now think it's completely off the chart with racism and anti-Semitism of all sorts. I also think it was the case maybe that certain things could be actually shifted in real life, as it were. Maybe, from my point, anti-Semitism or whatever else it might be. I now think it's a self-enclosed, terrible place where people just are able to shout at each other. So it's like having I think Twitter now is like having a sort of vase, an enclosed vase on your desk with shit flying around inside it. And you just watch it hit the walls. I think it doesn't actually, it does probably affect the real world. It's toxifying the world, but I don't want to get involved with it much anymore.
Yeah, but it also gives you some raw material because you actually do an amazing and fascinating thing, which is you take a whole lot of cells from the social media and you've worked them into your book so that in fact you've kind of stopped that moment. And that's almost in a way, kind of your form.
Well, I think in Jews Don't Count, which was written in 2021, I wanted to talk about this idea of what is the modern notion, because there's many books about anti-Semitism, right?
Cool.
Huge books about the history of anti-Semitism. This is a short book, it's an essay book, and I wanted to talk about something specific and focused, which is now we have a kind of voice, a conversation, a class, if you like, of people who are incredibly energized about discrimination and racism, but they're leaving out one type of discrimination and racism. Why? And where is that happening? Primarily, it's happening online. So that's why I needed, I think, to use screenshots of online. But actually, I think now, if I was to write another one, I would try and move away from that, because I kind of think I don't want to be dominated by that discourse.
But there's plenty of it in my family, though.
There's a bit of it in my family.
A bit of it.
Yeah. But there's just funny stuff in my family.
Are you sort of satisfied that this book worked?
Jews Don't Count.
Yeah,
it did work.
It did work.
Well, depends what you mean by worked. Obviously I get loads of hate about it. Which is one way of proving that it worked. I think it certainly in Britain, it shifted the dial a bit from Jews being completely out of the conversation or about that, and to being in it more. I think there were a number of different ways in which people reacted to it. Jews, in general, had a kind of sense of relief, of there's something that we all have been feeling about the way the world is and the way that people talk, and no one's quite naming it, and this book names it. But Jews, in a way, although they, I would hope people would feel less alone and all the rest of it, but they're not, in a way, the target. The target of the book is the kind of non-Jewish, good guy, good woman, on the right side of history, progressive, who somehow hasn't noticed that history has been really, really bad to Jews. Somehow they haven't noticed that. And so occasionally I see that in terms of has the book worked. A guy wrote to me and said exactly that. He wrote to me and he said, look, I'm a progressive. I think of myself as someone who really cares about all this stuff. But I read your book and I realized I do share unconsciously, some of the assumptions about Jews and power, Jews and money, Jews not needing the support of anyone else because they're not vulnerable enough. I share those, he said. And then he said this really great thing. He said, I'll try and think about that in future because I realize now that anti-Semitism is the racism that slips past you. And that's really important because it's not as obvious as other types of racism, anti-Semitism. It is really hard to spot. Jews, there's a whole bit in the book about Jews being Schrodinger's whites, meaning we are for the far right, we are non-white. Jews have always been non-white to the far right. Hitler absolutely wouldn't accept the idea that Jews were white. At the same time, the left sometimes see Jews as sort of super white because we are rich and privileged and all the things we're mythically supposed to be, right? So the book tries in a way to deal with all those things, and it's useful for me if it is thought of as a primer for those people to think about it and to understand the way that anti-Semitism works.
It's very different in many ways to the South African narrative,
right?
I must say, because we were not previously disadvantaged, and I know that you've spoken about the fact that power structures and money and all of that makes really no difference in a way to the perception actually from the outside of the Jewish community and Jewish people.
What I say in the book is that the notion of power at heart, it's complicated, but the simple reason why Jews don't count is because the world is now, particularly now, seen in a binary, and the binary is power versus powerless, the oppressed and the oppressor. And the thing about Jews is Jews are a glitch in that binary. Because of course some Jews are powerful, of course some Jews are rich, and of course Israel is the most powerful state in the Middle East, right? But also Jews have been incredibly vulnerable over their history. Jews have been exiled and genocided and destroyed, and it's incredible that they survive at all. And that has to be taken into account in this binary, because the binary shouldn't be as simple as that, right? And so one of the things I do say is that people who imagine that Jews don't need to count, don't need to be thought of in this way because they are rich. Firstly, lots of Jews aren't rich, but also money does not protect you in the end. My grandparents, as you heard from my family, were rich. They were rich in 1933. By 1939, they're fleeing for their lives. And most of their family's been murdered. So money is not a reason to say racism doesn't happen to these people.
Okay, so that brings us to the Q&A part of it.
I feel I brought it down. It was going really well with the jokes,
shit.
and then
okay,
I blame you.
No,
Matthew.
I did kind of store up some more like sort of rabbinical knowledge, but I've decided to do away with that.
No.
Lynn, would you like to ask a question? You just have to be loud because we're not giving the mic around the room. Sorry.
Yes, I saw you last in Gothenburg, and I'm calling security. No, I didn't. I sort of knew who you were. Okay.
Two things. One is, when we were growing up, I'm also a Jewish person, for disclosure. I'm not responsible for the war in the Middle East, but I'm a writer, and I asked you actually earlier, now I'm going to have to answer everyone. Writing while Jewish, in the sense of not a man with a beard in the sky, but as an ethnic, and it's the same question to everyone of any ethnicity who's now writing, who's being to blame for something that's happening in the world that's not our fault. I'd like you to just address the question of almost hashtag writing while Jewish. I know you do kids' stories, you do other things than essay pieces, but I want to know how it's affected you as a person of Jewish ethnicity and not religiosity writing forward. And the other part of the question is, did you not have Zionism in the sense of, we had all the youth movements in our 70s and 80s, the Zionist youth movements. Every aspect of the Jewish spectrum was collecting money for this imaginary homeland that was now real. And I just want to know if there was any part of your English childhood that touched you.
Okay. Quite a big two questions. So the first thing about writing Jewish, I noticed that you said, I'm Jewish, I'm not responsible for the war in the Middle East. You shouldn't say that. I'm just going to say you shouldn't say that. Because what's the voice in your head that's telling you that you are responsible, right? The voice in your head is other progressives, because you seem to be like a progressive, and people on the right now, who are saying a Jew cannot speak in public before they have sanitized themselves by saying that they have a distance from that, right? Now, I'm sure we do all have a distance from that, right? But my position, as regards Israel, has always been the same, and it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed. I mean, it's changed as regards the effect, but it hasn't changed as regards Israel, which is, it's a foreign country. I'm a British Jew. It's a foreign country. I am not responsible for it. And anyone who tells me I am is a racist. In the same way that if they said to Phil Wang, you are somehow responsible, or I need to hear what you think about the Chinese government, is a racist, right? That's my position on it. So you shouldn't say that, because that's internalized racism, in my opinion. And writing Jewish is perfectly easy to do if you're able to think that properly. Interestingly enough, as regards your second question, I went to Hub Onim. So Hub Onim is a Jewish youth movement that I went to when I was between the age of 9 and 16, which is a socialist Zionist kibbutz youth movement. But I went there because I was trying to get off with girls. And remarkably, I did. I mean, about once. It was like, I didn't do that well. Cheryl Bretman, thank you. But I basically just went there because it was a social club. And actually, when I was 16 and I realized, fucking hell, this is about trying to get people to make Aliyah and live in Israel, I'm not interested in that. Because I never felt very connected to that country, and I still don't. But that's a weird thing with Jews, I have to say. When I did my documentary, which I think you can see, I don't know if you can see it in this country, it's on, you probably can see it on YouTube. It's just called Jews Don't Count. But I screened it in Britain, and a woman called Victoria Corrin, do you know who she is? Victoria Corrin, she came up to me afterwards and she whispered to me, thank you for being the first Jew ever to publicly say, it's a foreign country, right? Because this assumption is that we don't think like that somehow or other. And by the way, I don't just mean the Jews who are incredibly supportive. I also mean the Jews like Miriam Margolis, who I interview on that, who hate it. And what I realized when I was interviewing Miriam Margolis, who's furious and angry and not in my name about Israel, much more connected to it than I am. Much more connected, because she feels very strongly that she has to say these things. I don't feel any of that, because it's not my country. It's not my country, and why should it be? Right? Because minorities who don't live in a country are not normally expected to feel they are part of that country.
Okay, I just want to add an addendum to that point, maybe you can address it. For me, perhaps, I finished your book about 2 weeks ago, and that particular book, and I want to look at the God Design next, by the way. But one of the things is that, yes, you don't have to be as a Jew, regardless of what your perspective is on the Middle East. You don't have to feel responsible for it. But I think what people don't understand is we as a Jew are international, as Jews are this kind of thread of international minorities, as well as the Jews in Israel. So when the massacre on October the 7th happened, that was a lot of people's families. I didn't have family there, but I knew people fighting in this war. I know people who were in incredible danger at that time. And so to say it's a foreign country is to imply that we don't have a connection to Jews, and we don't have a connection to, say, American Jews or Brazilian Jews.
No, that's not true. I don't, because I'm talking about a state. I'm talking about a state rather than personally with people. And obviously you might feel that, personally with people who you know. But the idea, and I'm also talking about intellectually, how you talk about discrimination and racism and stereotyping. And I just think it's really important for Jews, if they are to be, like Jews respond to Jews Don't Count as a positive attempt to make people who have never thought of Jews as a real minority, that they should think about them as a real minority who suffer racism and blah, blah, blah. Part of the problem with that is if Jews then do something which other minorities are not doing, which is to say, I live here, but I primarily want you to think of me, as from that country over there, or mainly emotionally connected. That's weird, I think, and not helpful in the creation of a way of thinking about Jews as exactly the way that we might think about any other minority.
Can you also think about, let's talk about like the LGBT community as
No, I'm not saying that Jews don't feel an emotional connection with other Jews. I'm saying that the idea that there is a state, a foreign country, that you have to...
What happens then matters because of that connection.
I think people want us to ask other questions, but I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. Sorry.
Why not?
Why what not?
So the thesis is that the only way to really battle anti-Semitism against Jews in countries outside of Israel is to treat Jews as a minority who don't necessarily have a connection historically or otherwise to Israel.
No, I'm not saying exactly that.
Can you explain the thesis a bit more?
Yes, I'm saying that that you have to. That you might have a connection. You might feel a connection to it. The assumption of a connection is wrong, right? So I'm talking mainly about the way that Jews are imagined by other progressive people who can continually shout down arguments about anti-Semitism by talking about Israel, right?
That's only because those progressives say that they're anti-Zionist, not anti-Semite.
No, it doesn't matter. No, that doesn't matter. I think that's unimportant because we. By the way, I don't just want to talk about this.
Yes,
like
exactly.
I mean,
It's going to be
the
like this.
last thing I wanted to do
Sure.
was travel overnight to Johannesburg to just talk about fucking Israel. To be honest with you,
There's
right?
Mr. Krouse. Would you like to ask a question?
No, because there are other things to talk about. That's all.
Why not?
Yes, you may engage around
Because I
snacks
genuinely don't.
afterwards. Why not?
That's very interesting. I must just. What's your name? Larissa, I genuinely do not feel an emotional connection to Israel. I think what happens in Israel affects Jews and affects anti-Semitism, but I don't feel like a profound emotional connection with it. And I know some Jews do, and I'm not saying that's terrible, but I'm saying the assumption that all Jews do is a racist one.
No, I get that, and I have no comment about your personal feelings. My question is, if, for example, I'm a Jew who lives in South Africa, and I'm discriminated against, okay, because of what's happening in Israel, and I'm saying, I'm a Jew, I feel a personal connection with this, or me, look, it doesn't matter what David Baker is. It's still not okay to discriminate against me as a Jew, correct?
No, well,
It was very strange. Who is discriminating against you as a Jew in South Africa?
Oh, since I was 5 years old.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, there you
But
go.
thank you. Thanks,
take that
Larissa.
up with
Thank
the
you.
Equality Court. David.
Could we hear about the Labour Party?
oh wow.
And that argument?
Actually, I must just tell you one thing. One thing that is quite entertaining about this is, so the book was written just at the end of Jeremy Corbyn, who I presume most of you know about, his heading the Labour Party, and when there'd been, one of the things about that, and one of the things why I wanted to write the book, because I was just asked by the Times Literary Supplement to write an essay book about an important political subject, anything I wanted. And I'd just come through a period of noticing that anti-Semitism in Britain was like headlines. The people were talking about anti-Semitism inquiries and Jews, and it felt like really weird for the front cover of like The Guardian to have stuff like that in it. So to some extent it was written in that context. One of the things that is complicated about that is that lots of Jews were like, Corbyn's an anti-Semite. I never thought Corbyn was an anti-Semite. What I thought was that Corbyn represents absolutely a type of progressive on the left for whom anti-Semitism is very, very low on their list of priorities. And that may be seen as a form of anti-Semitism, but it's not straightforward. So, for example, when Jeremy Corbyn, as he did before he was Labour Party head, when he spoke up for a mural, I don't know if you know about this, it's in the book. There was a mural in East London, and it was meant to be a sort of statement by an artist, a street artist, fighting for the poor of the world. It had black and brown people being sort of kneeling down, and on top of them, all these men were playing Monopoly with money on the backs of the global poor, right? Now, what then happened was that Jewish people in the East End, where it happened, noticed that all these men had hooked noses and beards and looked unbelievably Jewish. And the artist, when he wrote about this, said, yes, they are. They're Warburg. They're Rothschild, right? And he just reacted like a progressive, an anti-racist, in like, suck it up rich Jews or whatever, and Jeremy Corbyn kind of supported him. And my point about that is that Corbyn is seeing only one thing. He's only seeing that this is a revolutionary statement. This is punching up. This is fighting back against the man. And so obviously Jeremy Corbyn supports that, but he doesn't see his enormous blind spot about how that is always imagined, that power, that man, as Jewish. Let me just tell you a very quick story, about quite a funny thing with that, which is, so I was on a British news TV show, and they asked me about Corbyn. It was actually, I shouldn't have answered, because it was Holocaust Memorial Day last year, and I should have said, I don't want to talk about Corbyn on Holocaust Memorial Day, but I was being polite, and I answered, and I said this thing. Again, they asked me about, is he an anti-Semite? I said, not at the front of his mind, right? And then Corbyn was interviewed on this very famous podcast, The News Agents in Britain. They brought that up, they showed him the footage, and he was really angry about it. And what he said was, how does David Baddiel know what's at the front or the back of my mind? Is he my psychiatrist? And Frank Skinner said, does he think all psychiatrists are Jews? Which is absolutely great. But here's the serious point. The serious point is, I shouldn't have said not at the front of his mind. What I should have done is spoken his language. I should have said what he shows is unconscious bias towards Jews, right? Because then it would have been slightly more difficult for Jeremy Corbyn to say, well, I can't show unconscious. He might still have said the psychiatrist thing. But basically what I mean is, if Jeremy Corbyn accepts that if you are not a member of a minority, then you must show unconscious bias against that minority, then a non-Jew must show unconscious bias against Jews. So I should have said that and not the front of his mind thing.
Okay, there for you, mister.
Thanks. No one's mentioned that yet. Thank you.
My other question is, so you've been a comedian on TV, you've been on stage, you've written books. Like, what's brought you to go and write a comedy book, from a commercial sort of point of view? Is it, like, why did you do it? I mean, personally,
Why did I become a comedian, or why did I write?
Why did you bring on a book now instead of doing something else?
Why did I bring out my family now? Well, my family, I've done it as a show. I've done it twice in the West End. It was nominated for an Olivier Award. I lost to a fucking ballet. Can you believe it? Like, yeah, of course I did. And now I've also done it on TV. I've done it on Sky Arts in Britain. So what I felt was that I wanted to tell the story slightly more depth, slightly more psychological nuance in it, in ways that I can't do in an hour and a half comedy show. And I think I like the idea of writing a book that is really funny. I think that, I've written a few books that I think aspire to stand up in a way. They aspire to be as funny as a stand-up show.
In our current world where young people are on TikTok and internet and YouTube, do you think people can make careers in their 30s by starting with funny books as opposed to funny online?
Do I think, I don't know if anyone can hear that, do I think that in a world dominated by TikTok and online and whatever, that people in their 30s, you said, because I think probably they're younger, the people on TikTok, can start their careers writing funny books? I don't know. I think it's not over for the book, to be honest. I think that TikTok and Instagram and Reels and all that have created a very short-term way of looking at the world, but I think there's also, by the way, I think some of that stuff is really good. I mean, the thing that weaned me off Twitter was Instagram Reels, and now I look at them much more often, and my algorithm is just cats, comedy, cooking, and sort of old interviews with people like Jean-Paul Sartre, and I think, that means I'm a good person when I say I'm pleased with my algorithm. Whereas on Twitter, that would just be hate and toxicity. So anyway, I don't know the answer to your question, but I think it's not over for the book, and I think I Love Books is the place to say that.
Lovely.
So,
and also tomorrow,
thank you for that round of applause.
you are going to be talking, or you're going to be presenting your literature for young readers. Where's that going to be, Miriam? In Cresta. What time? At 3
I don't think they could turn up, though, because it's at a school, but it'd be weird.
Is it in a school? No,
it's
in
not.
a mall.
People can turn up.
It's in a bookshop.
I thought it was. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon.
No.
do turn up in that case.
Yeah.
There's someone at the back. Hello.
On that note, I actually know your work primarily through children's books.
Right.
And I'd just love to know what you enjoy about writing children's books for such a wide range of writing.
Well, what happened with the children's books is David Walliams had been writing children's books in Britain and had done well, and I wasn't bothered about writing just because there was a sudden like this market for comedians writing children's books. I thought, I haven't got an idea, but lots of publishers wanted me to write one. And then my son, Ezra, when he was 8, he said to me, Dad, why doesn't Harry Potter run away from the Dursleys, you know, the Muggle family, and try and find some better parents, right? And that gave me an idea, which is a world in which children can choose their own parents. And I wrote a book called The Parent Agency, in which Barry, the kid, who's fucked off because he's called Barry, he goes through his bedroom wall into a world run by kids where kids can choose their own parent. I've just done a musical of it, which has just opened in London. And not London, actually it's opened in Manchester, but hopefully we'll come to London. And because that was it turned out like, as soon as Ezra said that, I thought, that's definitely a good idea for a kid's story. And it didn't bother me that the idea came from my son. It should have bothered me that the idea for a world in which children could choose different parents came from my son. Not at all bothered. And he was 8, and the book came out, he asked for royalties. I thought, you know, that's the Jewish kid who's been like raised in the wild of my house. But I bought him an iPod, I remember. I thought that was... Anyway, I love writing for children because there's a part of me that just wants to sort of let the imagination go when I write. So when I write non-fiction, it's unbelievably tied to the truth. So this book, as Matthew said earlier on, it's like all of it is ultra true, and there are footnotes in it where I've refined the truth because I can't bear it. The stuff isn't true. Whereas there's a sort of another part of me that wants stuff to be utterly imaginative, and children's stories are good for that. And also I really like story. That's what I am, really. I'm a storyteller, primarily, and children's books allow, in a way that no other genre does, actually, for a very high focus on story, as opposed to sort of tone and whatever. This man, because you've had to go. No, this man at the front. Also, you might ask about Israel again. Sorry. Okay.
I primarily came to you from Taskmaster.
Taskmaster, yeah, cool.
That's, I'm sure you get that a lot.
Yeah.
But it's something that we saw that was not connected to Judaism at all, and also was something that seemed very silly and seemed very like.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, with your comedy and with your, things that you work on, do you feel responsibility for it to have a social meaning, or for it to have a message in it all the time, or would you prefer? Well, prefer, but would you be more open to the idea of just doing things just for the hilarity of it?
Yeah. So the question was, you came to me via Taskmaster. I don't know if anyone saw me on Taskmaster. I was the worst contestant they've ever had on Taskmaster, and that was sort of why I did it, because I get asked to do various sort of celebrity things. I got asked to do Strictly Come Dancing and all that stuff, and I just knew I'd be utterly shit on Strictly, but not in a funny way. Whereas Taskmaster, I thought, I'll be shit, it'll be funny. It'll be how I'm shit will be funny here. I mean, I don't know if anyone saw it, but for example, there's one bit, if anyone watches Taskmaster, where I was supposed to lasso Alex Horne. I don't know if I'm speaking to anyone. Oh, you brought it. Oh, wow. Well, don't give the punchline. That's weird. I'm going to have to come back to that. That's amazing. So I had to lasso Alex Horne from a distance, and I couldn't do it, and I took the longest to do it, and eventually I tied 7 wooden spoons to the lasso, because that seemed to me to be the way to do it. And I remember Greg, the host, said to me, yeah, the problem for you, David, is some of these tasks are quite difficult, and you have the added difficulty of being David Baddiel. That was very true, following on from that. But you have brought a wooden spoon to sign it. Okay, great. I'm glad that's become a legendary moment. So much so that just spontaneously you brought it. But yeah, it's mentioned in here as well. It's mentioned that moment. But I did loads of things. There was another thing which is really funny, I think, where me and Jo Brand, do you know Jo Brand? Brilliant female comedian. Me and Jo Brand, who were the oldest contestants by miles on that show, we were asked to do a series of tasks. And in the second episode, and one of them is we have to make a cup of tea. So we make the cup of tea, and then I say, should we just sit and chat for a bit? and we sit and chat, we have a cup of tea, and then I hadn't realised it's a timed task, right? So we come in like 4 hours later, and we've lost so badly. But I wasn't listening when someone said it was a timed task. So yeah, so I was very bad. So to answer your question, I love comedy that is purely silly. My favourite comedian is Norm Macdonald. I don't know if you know him, the American comedian, who never told a socially aware joke in his life. And I love Python and all sorts of things. And the first thing that when I was first, like the thing about selling out Wembley, that was based on a show I did called The Mary Whitehouse Experience. And the big sketch that me and Rob Newman did was called History Today. And History Today was me and Rob Newman dressing up as old history professors, pretending to do a history program, but saying in the end things like, you see that bit of flob on the ground, that's you, that is. And just, it's a bit like this, in fact. It looked a bit like this, and that was just purely silly, and people loved it. So no, I don't prize socially aware comedy above other things, but as I've got older, I've wanted to write serious stuff, and I'm not leaving comedy behind in the writing of that serious stuff. So Jews Don't Count, The God Desire, they've all got jokes in them, even though their purpose is kind of serious. Is it time for me to sign some books?
Yes, it is. I think that's a good spot to
Can I tell a story to finish with?
Yep.
I just want to tell a story because I want to go out on a laugh because I'm still a comedian at heart. So one of the ways in which Jews Don't Count really had an impact I wasn't expecting was the amount of Jews who wrote to me and told me that they would never tell anyone they're Jewish. A kind of like outpouring of Jewish shame. And the book had helped them with that these were Jews in the closet and that they felt that Jews Don't Count helped them with that. And that was like older people who had Holocaust survivor parents, but also young people, who didn't want to tell people probably because of Israel and stuff, right? So anyway, my best example of Jewish shame was in 1999. I was being interviewed outside the FA Cup final, outside Wembley Stadium, by a man called Jim Rosenthal. And Jim Rosenthal was a TV football presenter in the 80s and 90s. And as a Jew, I thought, Jim Rosenthal, he's Jewish. And I was quite excited that there was a Jew on my telly. It was quite exciting. He looked pretty Jewish, blah, blah, blah. And so when I met him, I'm being interviewed with Frank Skinner, and Jim Rosenthal is talking to us, and I make a little joke, right, because it's a Saturday. I say, Jim, should you really be working on Shabbos? Right? And it doesn't get much of a laugh, a little, sort of like it got tonight. And Jim is really angry. Jim doesn't laugh at all. Jim starts saying, I'm not Jewish. I'm not Jewish. I get out of that because of my mum. So presumably Jim Rosenthal's dad was Jewish, his mum wasn't, and he believes in that. That makes you not Jewish. But it was really awkward. It was the opposite, the absolute opposite of what minorities are meant to do, which is own their ethnicity and be visible and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it was really awkward and embarrassing. Then in 2002, I was at the World Cup in Japan. I'd gone to Japan for the World Cup. And some of you may know, in Japan, at your hotel, there's often a great big spa area at the bottom of your hotel. I like a spa area. I went to the one at the Houghton just now. Very good. Yeah, it was lovely. Anyway, I go down to the bottom of this Japanese hotel, and there's a massive sauna. And sitting there on his own in this sauna, naked, is Jim Rosenthal. And I'll tell you what, he fucking is Jewish. Thank you. Come and get a book signed. Cheers.
Okay, thank you so much, David and Matthew, for a wonderful evening. Thank you. David is going to be signing books at the table inside the shop. Books are for sale up the stairs. Thank you for coming.